Oceans cover over 70% of the Earth, and it is estimated that 50 to 80% of all life is held within them. Because of the amount of space our oceans take up, there has been a historical belief that they were able to mix and disperse anything placed within them, specifically waste. This led to massive dumping in the oceans, causing oxygen levels to diminish, human health risks to increase, and biodiversity and natural resources to be threatened. In the 1920s, the world really began recognizing the harm of dumping waste in the ocean. Countries around the world began meeting and discussing these issues, hoping to come to an agreement. In 1975, the Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping of Waste and Other Matter, or more commonly known as the London Convention, became effective. The goal of this treaty was to supervise and inhibit marine pollution by regulating the dumping of waste materials into the sea. Ocean dumping as an environmental issue was first addressed at the 1926 Washington, D.C. International Conference. This conference was held to discuss and solve the problem of oil being released from ships. As a result of this event, a draft was composed. This draft was never ratified, and ocean dumping was ignored for another 28 years. In 1954, ocean dumping was once more addressed in London at the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution of the Sea by Oil. This convention resulted in an agreement to prevent oil pollution due to ships, but it does not apply to sediment or accidental spills if precautions are taken. The agreement allowed for oil pollution as long as it was far from land. The United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea was held in 1958 in Geneva. Here, 4 treaties were created, one of which being the Convention on the High Seas. This convention focused on radioactive waste, and the goal was to prevent pollution by restricting disposal of this type of waste in the sea. These measures were insufficient to solve the problem of marine dumping, so in 1969 the Intergovernmental Maritime Consultative Organization, or IMCO, held another conference, the International Conference on Marine Pollution. 2 major conventions were opened by this conference, the Public Law Convention and the Civil Liability Convention. These 2 conventions were important due to the fact that they were the first to focus on the rights of coastal states on stopping marine pollution. All of these conferences and conventions helped lead to the creation of the London Convention, raising awareness of the problem that is ocean dumping.
The revelation of scientific evidence due to the publication of Ocean Dumping, a National Policy, which was a report by the U.S. Council on Environmental Policy, spurred momentum in addressing the issue of ocean dumping. Negotiations of the London Convention began during the preparatory meetings for the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, Sweden. The UN Secretariat formed the Intergovernmental Working Group on Marine Pollution, or the IWGMP, to handle issues of ocean dumping. The IWGMP held 4 meetings prior to the UN conference. The first meeting was held in June of 1971 in London, where 33 states were in attendance. This meeting saw general support for action on the issue of ocean dumping. At this meeting, the United States proposed a draft entitled Convention for the Regulation of Transportation for Ocean Dumping that was meant to serve as a starting point for discussion. The draft only applied to dumping by transportation vehicles, such as ships and planes, with no restrictions on land-based ocean pollution sources such as polluted runoff from rivers. It gave power to individual states to issue dumping permits and to define which substances could or could not be dumped, and required states to report data on their allowed dumping. The draft was criticized for giving too much power to individual states, as each state was free to define how much and what kind of dumping was appropriate. The Canadian delegation called it a license to pollute, due to the document refraining from taking a stance on the prohibition of dumping. Canada submitted their own principles. Among these included general principles on ocean disposal and general considerations. One of the general considerations included the idea that it should not be assumed that the oceans have a limitless capacity to mitigate pollution. Brazil was another vocal participant, and during the meeting they expressed concerns about the ability of developing nations in particular to cooperate with strict regulations on dumping. Brazil asserted that any policies proposed that would hinder economic development, especially the development of industries that rely on ocean transport, would be unrealistic. However, Brazil did agree that there was a shared responsibility to take action to protect the oceans. The IWGMP agreed that a global ocean dumping regime was necessary, and they emphasized the importance of urgency to the states in attendance. The second meeting was held in Ottawa in November of 1971, where there were 42 states in attendance. There was a collective growing interest in solving this issue. The Minister of the Environment of Canada, Jack Davis, reaffirmed his country's goals of protecting global waters from pollution. He urged collective action to cut off pollution at its source, as well as joint studies and research to enable governments to deal with particular crises. He also stated that additional scientific research was not needed in order to act at the present time. Canada believed that acting on the scientific evidence already available was a crucial step forward. The IWGMP agreed with Canada's stance, advocating that immediate action could produce meaningful results. The IWGMP also saw this as an opportunity to showcase the importance of international cooperation on environmental policy. At this meeting, the North-South divide on ocean dumping became much more prevalent. One of the principles agreed on at the second meeting was that developed states should assist developing nations with equipment and technology to facilitate meeting the agreements. Additionally, one principle noted that states should ensure that their vessels comply to environmentally friendly construction standards. Brazil noted at this meeting that developing countries may struggle to comply with these standards. In April 1972, a third meeting was held in Reykjavik by the IWGMP. 29 countries were in attendance, but notably no Brazilian delegate attended this meeting, which was possibly indicative of Brazil's growing concern with developed countries' roles in the negotiations. Instead, other developing countries continued to raise concerns similar to those laid out by Brazil in previous meetings. 1 month before the Stockholm Conference, a final meeting was convened in hopes to come to an agreement about issues still lingering from Reykjavik, such as alternative methods to dispose of waste and a way to effectively monitor the dumping of waste. Officials from 17 states met for 2 days in London, but in the end, no agreement was met about these issues. However, the IWGMP did appoint delegates to form a working group for drafting. A draft was formed from various components of drafts presented by states in attendance to the meetings. The London Convention's next major considerations occurred at the Stockholm Conference, where a draft of the convention was reviewed. General recommendations were given regarding ocean dumping, including that governments should work towards signing a policy on ocean dumping by the end of 1972. In late 1972, another final conference was held in London, with 92 states in attendance to finalize the London Convention. At this meeting, many developed countries pushed for the finalized language of the convention to be less restrictive, in hopes that fewer restrictions on dumping could reduce the economic impacts of the convention. Despite this, Brazil rejected the final document and declined to sign. This decision was a culmination of a north-south divide that had been prevalent throughout the negotiation process. Many northern nations showed interest in protecting the oceans, but were wary of restrictions on specific substances like radioactive waste. They feared reducing their ability to dump these substances would impede on their own development. However, many southern nations, Brazil included, feared that the tight restrictions would hinder their economic growth. Canada was again a major influencer, working closely with developing nations to reach an agreement. Brazil was unsatisfied with the final outcomes, however, and believed that northern states had overshadowed southern interests. The London Convention went into effect on August 30th, 1975, but it wasn't until 1982 that Brazil signed. Today, 87 countries have signed the London Convention.
The objective of the London Convention was to promote the effective control of all sources of marine pollution and take all practicable steps to prevent pollution of the sea by dumping of wastes and other matter. Article 1 of the London Convention outlines the expectation that all contracting parties have an individual and collective responsibility to advocate for the effective restriction of all sources of marine pollution. This article stresses the importance of reducing marine pollution in order to combat the threat to human health and marine life. Article 2 builds upon Article 1, emphasizing that actions taken by contracting parties need only be to the extent of their scientific, technical, and economic capabilities. This was likely included to appease developing countries such as Brazil, who argued that they would be less capable to make large contributions in reducing marine pollution. The London Convention defines the term dumping in Article 3 as the intentional disposal of man-made waste materials at sea, including vessels, aircrafts, and platforms. In contrast, the term dumping does not include the waste produced by operation of man-made materials at sea or placement of man-made materials at sea for any purpose other than deliberate disposal. Article 6 discusses the designation procedure required to issue special and general permits. These are issued by appropriate authorities assigned by each contracting party. The London Convention lists two groups of substances for which dumping is restricted. These annexes were determined depending on the potential of the substances to harm the environment. Annex 1 defines blacklist items which are prohibited from being disposed of at all times, regardless of permit acquired. Annex 2 defines grey list items, dumping of which requires special permits to be obtained prior. General permits are required to be obtained prior to the dumping of all other matter. Annex 3 outlines the criteria to be taken into consideration when issuing permits to dump matter at sea. Firstly, the characteristics and composition of the matter need to be reviewed. This includes the total amount, the form, properties, toxicity of matter dumped, and the probability of the matter to impact resources such as fish. Secondly, the characteristics of the dumping site and the method of deposit needs to be reviewed. This include assessment of the location, rate of disposal, methods of packaging, dilution, and disposal characteristics. Besides this, other factors including impacts on marine life, fisheries and culture, and other uses of the marine environment, and the practicality of dumping in an alternative land-based area need to be considered. With assistance from the International Maritime Organization and other international bodies, the contracting parties are required to support for parties which request for training of scientific and technical personnel, supply of necessary equipment and facilities for research and monitoring, and disposal and treatment of waste and other measures to prevent or reduce pollution by dumping. Contracting parties are responsible for reporting and monitoring waste disposed of at sea. The authority that each contracting party elects is responsible for keeping records of the properties, time, location, method, and amount of matter disposed of, as well as monitoring compliance of the contracting party. This self-reporting system, however, has led to many instances in which parties did not report, leading to the questioning of the effectiveness of self-reporting.
At the present time, the goal is to completely phase out the London Convention and instead convert to the London Protocol. The Protocol went into effect March 24, 2006. Currently, 50 states are parties to the Protocol, which is far less than the initial 87 in the Convention. Canada, who had a strong interest in the London Convention, is one of the members of the Protocol, while Brazil, who had already been wary of the Convention, never signed into the Protocol. Even the United States, a vocal advocate for the London Convention, also never signed the Protocol. In this protocol, all dumping is prohibited, aside from wastes that are present on the reverse list. Wastes that may cause exceptions include dredged material, fish wastes, inert inorganic geological material, specific bulky items, sewage sludge, vessels and platforms or other man-made structures at sea, organic material of natural origin, and carbon dioxide streams from carbon dioxide capture processes. Overall, the London Convention made great strides towards solving the problem of ocean dumping, but underlying issues still remain. The North and South are as divided as ever, and creating a solution that works for both parties is proving to be difficult. The North is more inclined toward combating ocean dumping, whereas the South recognizes their contribution to dumping is minimal and the Convention and Protocol hinder their ability to develop. The current focus is to phase out the London Convention and completely switch to the London Protocol, but this is also proving to be difficult. Much more of the South were on board with the London Convention than the London Protocol, showing dwindling support due to lack of resources and inability to abide to such stringent regulations. In the end, however, protecting the oceans is a global issue, and cooperation from both the North and South will be needed to make a lasting impact.